There is a sentence attributed to Jesus of Nazareth that has frightened generations of believers. It does not condemn murder, theft, betrayal, or public scandal. It condemns a look. According to the Gospel of Matthew, a man who looks at a woman with the intention of desiring her has already committed adultery in his heart. No secret meeting, no physical affair, no broken marriage discovered by witnesses. Only a glance, only a thought, only something hidden inside the mind. For almost 2,000 years, those words have been used to inspire self-control, defend marriage, warn against exploitation, and demand moral integrity. But they have also produced fear, shame, confusion, and a haunting question that many believers have been afraid to ask. Was Jesus teaching that sexual attraction itself is sinful? Was he demanding the impossible, the elimination of desire? Or have centuries of interpretation transformed a warning about power and possession into a war against the human body? The mystery becomes even deeper when we examine the rest of the evidence. The same Jesus who spoke with extraordinary severity about adultery also attended a wedding celebration. He allowed women to travel with his movement. He spoke publicly with women in ways that surprised his own disciples. He defended people whose reputations had been destroyed. He placed love at the center of the moral life, and yet he also spoke of people who lived like eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. He appeared to remain unmarried. He warned that family loyalties could stand in the way of discipleship. He declared that in the resurrection, human beings would no longer marry. Love, desire, marriage, celibacy, fidelity, temptation, mercy. The pieces refused to form a simple picture. To understand what Jesus may have meant, we must travel back before the churches, before the monasteries, before medieval confessional manuals, before modern arguments about sexuality. We must return to a world where marriage was rarely a private romance, where a woman's survival could depend upon the decisions of a husband, where family honor shaped every public interaction, and where the arrival of a wandering teacher could threaten the moral structure of an entire village. The first clue is hidden in the landscape. Galilee in the early 1st century was not the peaceful biblical painting imagined by later artists. It was a region living beneath imperial power. Rome ruled from a distance, but its presence could be felt in taxation, construction projects, political appointments, military authority, and the ambitions of local rulers. Herod Antipas governed Galilee as a client of Rome. New urban centers displayed wealth and imperial influence, while many rural families lived close to economic disaster. A failed harvest, an unpaid debt, or the death of a male provider could push a household toward ruin. In that world, the family was more than a place of affection. It was an economic unit, a system of inheritance, a source of labor, a network of protection, and the primary institution through which identity survived. Marriage connected households. It created alliances. It organized property. It produced heirs. Affection could certainly exist. Ancient people were not emotionally empty. They loved, mourned, desired, and formed deep attachments. But marriage was usually surrounded by social expectations that modern ideas of private romantic choice do not fully capture. The moral language of adultery must be understood inside that structure. In the biblical legal tradition, adultery was not merely an act of private disloyalty between two equal romantic partners. It could also be understood as a violation of household boundaries, male honor, inheritance, and legitimate descent. This does not mean ancient people had no concern for faithfulness or emotional betrayal. It means that the social consequences of sexual behavior were tied to property, family status, and the survival of the household in ways that are easy to overlook today. Biblical discussions of marriage, adultery, and divorce emerged from an ancient world in which these institutions were deeply connected to household power and economic order. Then Jesus entered the argument. In the Gospel accounts, he did not begin by writing a new legal code. He moved from village to village, teaching in houses, fields, synagogues, and public spaces. His sayings were remembered, repeated, translated, organized, and eventually written into narratives by early Christian authors. This matters because the Gospels are not recordings made during his sermons. They are ancient theological biographies shaped by memory, oral tradition, community experience, and the purposes of their authors. Most historians do not treat every sentence as a word-for-word transcript. At the same time, many sayings preserve early traditions that scholars consider valuable, when reconstructing the teaching of Jesus. The task is not to choose between total acceptance and total rejection. The task is to ask what kind of text we are reading. Each gospel presents a distinctive portrait. Mark emphasizes urgency, conflict, secrecy, and suffering. Matthew presents Jesus as an authoritative interpreter of aerial scriptures. Luke repeatedly draws attention to the poor, outsiders, women, forgiveness, and reversal. John offers long theological conversations unlike the shorter sayings and parables found in the other three. These portraits overlap, but they are not identical. The gospel writers were not neutral court reporters. They were interpreters of faith, preserving what their communities believed the life and meaning of Jesus revealed. That does not make their testimony useless. It means their history is inseparable from theology. And it is in Matthew's portrait that we encounter the most disturbing sentence. Jesus begins with a familiar commandment: do not commit adultery. Then he moves the boundary. He says that whoever looks at a woman in order to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. For centuries, the key English word has often been lust. But the Greek verb behind it, epitimio, does not automatically mean sinful sexual desire. It can mean to desire, to long for, or to set one's heart upon something. Its moral quality depends upon context. In another gospel scene, related language is used when Jesus earnestly desires to share the Passover meal with his disciples. The word itself is not a synonym for evil. Desire can be good. Desire can be ordinary. Desire can also become destructive. The question is not whether a human being experiences longing. The question is what the person intends to do with another human being inside that longing. This changes the investigation. Perhaps Jesus was not condemning the involuntary recognition that another person is attractive. Perhaps he was condemning the deliberate cultivation of a possessive intention. The difference is enormous. Attraction can arise before conscious choice. It may appear without invitation and disappear without action. But to look in order to possess, to reduce a person to something mentally consumed, pursued, or taken, is no longer a passive response. It is a direction of the will. Some interpreters, therefore, connect Matthew's language not only to the commandment against adultery but also to the commandment against coveting a neighbor's wife. In that reading, the subject is not merely biological impulse. It is appropriation. The person being observed is no longer encountered as a full human being with freedom, dignity, relationships, and a life beyond the observer's desire. She is transformed into an object inside someone else's imagined possession. That interpretation does not make Jesus' teaching easy. It makes it more demanding. The law can prevent an outward act. A court can investigate behavior. A community can punish a public violation, but no institution can fully police the hidden movement of the heart. Jesus relocates the moral crisis from the final action to the process that produces it. Before betrayal becomes a meeting, it becomes permission. Before exploitation becomes contact, it becomes a way of seeing. Before another person is used in public, that person may already have been dehumanized in private. The hidden side of Jesus' teaching may therefore be that morality begins before anyone else can see it. But another problem immediately appears. If Jesus was addressing men who possessed greater social power in marriage and divorce, then his words may have been directed less against human sexuality in general and more against the entitlement of the observer. Notice the grammar. The man is not told that the woman's existence has caused his sin. The responsibility remains with the one who looks. That detail seems obvious, but history has often reversed it. Religious communities have sometimes responded to male desire by controlling women's clothing, movement, speech, education, and public presence. The woman becomes responsible for preventing the man's thoughts. Yet in Matthew's scene, Jesus does not command the woman to disappear. He confronts the eye and intention of the person who desires to possess her. The moral burden remains with the observer. Then comes the language of tearing out an eye or cutting off a hand. Taken literally, it is horrifying. But Jesus regularly used extreme images to create moral shock. A camel attempting to pass through the eye of a needle, a person swallowing a camel while filtering out a gnat, a servant owing an impossibly large debt, a plank of wood lodged in someone's eye. The violence of the metaphor is aimed at complacency. Do not negotiate with the pattern that destroys another person. Do not pretend that hidden habits are harmless merely because they have not yet become visible. Remove what leads you toward exploitation, even when the removal is costly. The body is not identified as the enemy. The body becomes the stage upon which the seriousness of moral choice is dramatized, but later Christian readers did not always preserve that distinction. As Christianity expanded across the Roman world, the teaching of Jesus entered cultures shaped by Greek philosophy, Roman household structure, Jewish moral tradition, apocalyptic expectation, and competing ideas about the body. Some philosophical traditions admired self-mastery. Certain thinkers treated bodily passions as forces that reason must govern. Some religious movements connected purity with withdrawal from ordinary life. Early Christians did not simply copy one philosophy. They created new combinations. At the center of those combinations stood an unmarried Jesus. The canonical Gospels never identify a wife of Jesus. They describe mothers, brothers, sisters, disciples, opponents, female supporters, and close friends, but no spouse. Absence of evidence is not mathematical proof. Ancient biographies can omit personal information, yet the silence is significant. If Jesus had been publicly married, his wife would likely have occupied a recognizable place within the traditions about his family and followers. Instead, the earliest surviving Christian sources present him as unattached to a household of his own and wholly devoted to the proclamation of God's kingdom. Later legends and modern theories have proposed that Jesus married Mary Magdalene. But the canonical Gospels do not say this, and no surviving first-century source identifies her as his wife. Mary Magdalene is important for a different reason. She was one of the women who followed the movement. According to Luke, several women traveled with Jesus and the 12 and supported the group from their resources. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and others were not background decorations. They helped sustain the mission. The women later appear as witnesses to the crucifixion, burial, and empty tomb traditions. Their presence challenges the popular image of the Jesus movement as a group composed only of men. The gospel material portrays women as supporters, students, witnesses, and carriers of the message. For centuries, however, Mary Magdalene was frequently confused with unnamed women in other gospel stories. She was portrayed as a prostitute, although the canonical texts never call her one. A woman described as sinful enters a meal in Luke and anoints Jesus. Mary of Bethany anoints him in another tradition. Mary Magdalene is introduced separately as a follower who had been healed. Later interpretation blended these identities. The result was one of the most influential character transformations in Western religious history. A prominent female disciple and resurrection witness became, in popular imagination, the repentant sexual sinner. This shift reveals something large. Whenever Christian tradition discussed women, desire, and morality, it often stood in danger of interpreting female presence through the category of sexual temptation. A woman close to Jesus could not simply be a disciple. She had to become either a symbol of purity or a symbol of sexual sin. But the gospel narratives are more complicated. Jesus speaks with women in public. He allows a woman to sit at his feet, not sister of a disciple. He accepts material support from women. He praises women as examples of faith. He permits a suffering woman to touch him despite purity concerns surrounding her condition. He refuses to treat every encounter between a man and a woman as a sexual threat. This is one of the central contradictions in the history of interpretation. A teacher whose movement created unusual spaces for women would later be invoked by institutions that sometimes restricted women in the name of controlling desire. To say this is not to claim that Jesus was a modern campaigner for gender equality. He lived in the 1st century, not the 21st. The 12 named in the gospel tradition are male. His teachings sometimes use the social assumptions of his time. But the evidence does show that women participated actively in his movement, and that several gospel scenes placed them in roles that could surprise ancient audiences. Luke's account even emphasizes how unusual their association with an itinerant teacher could appear within the social setting. Then the investigation reaches divorce. When religious leaders question Jesus about whether a man may divorce his wife, they are not asking a modern question about mutual separation between economically independent partners. They are debating a male right recognized within the legal and social world of the period. The Torah describes a husband writing a certificate and dismissing a wife. The procedure could offer the woman some legal recognition that the marriage had ended, but the initiative described in the text belongs to the husband. The consequences could be severe. A divorced woman might remarry, return to relatives, or survive through other means. But her security endangered, reputation, household protection, economic support, and future prospects were all at stake. Jesus answers by returning to the creation stories. Human beings were made for union, he argues, and what God has joined should not be casually separated. In Mark's version, the prohibition is forceful. Matthew includes an exception whose precise meaning has been debated for centuries. Christian traditions continue to disagree over how the teaching should be applied to adultery, abandonment, abuse, invalid marriage, civil divorce, and remarriage. But inside the first-century scene, one feature is difficult to ignore. Jesus limits the ability of a husband to discard a wife. His words may sound restrictive to modern listeners who understand divorce as a possible escape from destructive or dangerous relationships, and they have sometimes been applied in ways that trap people in harm. Yet in the original debate, the teaching also confronts male privilege. A wife cannot be treated as temporary household property, dismissed when another possibility becomes more desirable. Jesus transforms marriage from a contract controlled by convenience into a responsibility before God. That ideal can protect. It can also become oppressive when removed from its purpose. A command intended to restrain the powerful can be misused to imprison the vulnerable. This is one of the recurring patterns in religious history. A moral rule begins as a defense against exploitation. An institution gains control of the rule, the context disappears, and the person the rule was meant to protect becomes the person punished by it. Jesus' teaching on divorce therefore contains both a moral vision and a historical danger. The vision is radical fidelity. The danger is fidelity interpreted without mercy, safety, or attention to unequal power. The gospel texts themselves preserve variation. Matthew's exception differs from Mark's unqualified formulation, showing that early Christians were already transmitting and interpreting the teaching in different community settings. But why did Jesus speak so radically? The answer may lie in the kingdom of God. For Jesus, morality was not merely a system for producing respectable citizens. His proclamation carried urgency. God's reign was drawing near. The world was being called to repentance. The poor would be lifted. The powerful would face judgment. The forgotten would be restored. Ordinary loyalties would be measured against a greater reality. This expectation changed the meaning of family, wealth, status, marriage, and desire. A man asks to bury his father before following Jesus. The response is severe. Another tradition says disciples must place loyalty to Jesus above father, mother, spouse, children, and even life itself. Jesus identifies those who do God's will as his true family. To modern ears, such sayings can sound emotionally cold, even dangerous. They can be, and have been, used by controlling groups to isolate people from relatives. But within the apocalyptic world of Jesus, they express the creation of an alternative community. The biological household is no longer the highest structure of loyalty. Those without husbands, wives, children, inheritance, or social protection can enter a new family defined not by blood but by commitment to God's kingdom. This could be destabilizing. It could also be liberating. A widow without powerful sons, a woman who could not marry, an infertile couple, a slave separated from relatives, or a person rejected by a household, could belong to a community where status was not supposed to depend upon family position. The kingdom did not merely regulate the household. It challenged the household's claim to be absolute. That challenge appears again when Jesus is asked about marriage after resurrection. His opponents construct a complicated case involving a woman who marries a series of brothers after each husband dies. Whose wife will she be when the dead rise? The question treats resurrection as a continuation of current social arrangements. Jesus rejects the assumption. In the resurrected life, he says, people neither marry nor are given in marriage. The statement is brief, but its implications are enormous. Marriage belongs to the present order. It may be sacred, meaningful, and morally serious, but it is not eternal in the same form. Human identity ultimately exceeds marital status. A person is not incomplete before God because that person has no spouse. A widow is not permanently defined by a dead husband. A woman passed from one brother to another is not an object that 7 men can claim in the next world. Resurrection breaks the chain of possession. This may be one of the least discussed dimensions of the scene. The woman in the hypothetical case never speaks. The men debate who owns the relationship. Jesus answers that the future cannot be organized through the same marital claims. The kingdom relativizes even the most respected human institution. Then comes the strange saying about eunuchs. Some are born that way, Jesus says. Some are made so by others, and some make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The saying has disturbed readers since antiquity. Was Jesus speaking literally? Was he endorsing physical mutilation? Was he describing celibacy through a shocking metaphor? The final possibility has dominated much Christian interpretation. Eunuchs occupied an ambiguous place in the ancient world. They could hold influential positions in royal households, yet they could also be ridiculed, marginalized, or treated as people who did not fit ordinary expectations of masculinity, marriage, and reproduction. To describe voluntary celibates as eunuchs was not gentle language. It challenged the assumption that every honorable man must marry, father children, control a household, and prove masculinity through reproduction. Jesus appears to say that some people may refuse that entire system for the kingdom. Marriage is not condemned, but neither is it compulsory. That was a revolutionary possibility in a society where family continuity carried enormous pressure. Later Christians treated Matthew's saying as a foundation for virginity and ascetic life. Interpretations varied between literal and metaphorical readings, although mainstream tradition rejected physical self-harm and understood the statement primarily as sexual renunciation. Celibacy could become a form of freedom. A person who did not marry could avoid an arranged union, household obligations, pregnancy, inheritance conflict, or dependence upon a spouse. For some early Christian women, renunciation offered an alternative identity beyond marriage and motherhood. A woman could become a respected ascetic, patron, teacher, widow devoted to the church, or member of a religious community. But celibacy could also create a hierarchy. The unmarried were increasingly imagined as spiritually superior. Marriage was permitted, but virginity was celebrated. Sex within marriage could be accepted, yet surrounded by suspicion. The body became a territory to be disciplined. Over the centuries, the distance between Jesus' brief sayings and elaborate Christian systems grew wider. Paul's letters played a major role. Writing before the Gospels reached their final forms, Paul advised the unmarried that remaining single could be beneficial, especially in view of the urgency he perceived. But he also recognized marriage and sexual relations within marriage. Paul was not simply hostile to the body. He used the body as a positive image for the Christian community and spoke of believers' bodies as belonging to God. Yet his preference for undivided devotion helped later Christians imagine celibacy as a higher calling. Then came martyrs, ascetics, desert communities, theologians, bishops, monks, and nuns. Each generation asked what it meant to master desire. Some withdrew from cities, some fasted severely, some renounced wealth, marriage, sleep, comfort, or social status. Some believed that the transformation of desire was evidence that the kingdom had already begun inside the human person. The body was not always hated. For many ascetics, the body was the instrument through which freedom could be practiced, but the language of battle carried a risk. When every impulse becomes an enemy, spiritual discipline can turn into self-contempt. When every attraction becomes evidence of corruption, ordinary human development can become a source of terror. When purity becomes status, those who fail can be humiliated while those who conceal their failure appear holy. The attempt to eliminate hypocrisy can produce a new and more secret hypocrisy. This is where the difference between Jesus and later systems becomes essential. Jesus speaks forcefully about the heart, but he also attacks public displays of righteousness. He warns against practicing devotion to be admired. He criticizes those who place heavy burdens on others while protecting their own status. He compares moral leaders obsessed with outward cleanliness to vessels polished outside while remaining corrupt within. His target is not simply desire, it is divided moral identity. A person condemns another publicly while feeding the same impulse privately. A religious leader controls vulnerable people while preserving a reputation for purity. A community punishes visible failure but ignores arrogance, exploitation, greed, and cruelty. For Jesus, sexual morality cannot be separated from the broader moral world. The same Sermon on the Mount that speaks of adultery in the heart also condemns contempt, revenge, dishonest speech, public performance, judgmentalism, and hatred of enemies. To isolate the sexual sentence from everything around it is to distort its scale. The heart that sexually possesses another person is part of the same heart that insults, manipulates, retaliates, and seeks admiration. The problem is not that sexuality is uniquely dirty. The problem is the human tendency to turn every appetite, sexual, financial, social, religious, or political, into domination. This becomes clearer in another teaching. When Jesus disputes with religious authorities about purity, he argues that corruption does not simply enter from outside. It proceeds from within, from intentions that produce theft, violence, adultery, greed, deceit, envy, pride, and other harms. Again, the direction is inward, but inward does not mean imaginary. The hidden intention matters because it eventually organizes behavior. Jesus is not replacing external ethics with private feelings. He is tracing external injustice to its concealed source. The heart, in biblical language, is not merely the location of emotion. It is the center of decision, intention, perception, and moral direction. To purify the heart is not to stop feeling. It is to stop allowing desire to become a system of exploitation. But the most famous gospel scene involving sexual accusation presents an unexpected complication. A woman is dragged before Jesus. She has allegedly been caught in adultery. Her accusers invoke the law and demand a judgment. Jesus bends down and writes on the ground. Then he tells the person without sin to cast the first stone. One by one, the accusers leave. Jesus refuses to condemn the woman and tells her to leave the life of sin behind. The scene is almost a perfect summary of mercy confronting public shame. It is also one of the most textually uncertain stories in the New Testament. The earliest Greek manuscripts of John do not contain it. In some later manuscripts, it appears in different locations. Its language differs from the surrounding material. Many scholars believe that the story circulated independently before being inserted into John. This does not prove the event never happened. An ancient tradition can preserve a genuine memory, even when it was not part of a gospel's earliest recoverable text. But historians cannot use it with the same confidence as a passage firmly embedded in the earliest manuscript tradition. The distinction matters. For Christian communities that accept the passage as scripture, its spiritual authority remains. For historical investigation, its origin is uncertain. Faith and textual history are asking different questions. Yet even as a later tradition, the story reveals what many early Christians believed was recognizably consistent with Jesus. The accusers isolate the woman. The man involved in the alleged adultery is absent. The law becomes a weapon. Public morality becomes theater. Jesus does not declare adultery harmless, but he breaks the machinery of humiliation by forcing the judges to confront themselves. The moral gaze turns around. Those who arrive to expose another person are exposed by their own conscience. That movement appears throughout the gospel tradition. Jesus does not abolish responsibility. He abolishes the fantasy that condemnation belongs to people who possess no need for mercy. This is why his harshest language is often directed not at people with damaged reputations, but at those who transform morality into superiority. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. He accepts the tears of a woman whose presence shocks respectable guests. He tells stories in which the morally compromised return home while the self-righteous remain emotionally outside. He offers forgiveness, but forgiveness is never presented as permission to exploit. Mercy and transformation remain connected. The difficult balance is deliberate. Mercy without moral responsibility can ignore victims. Moral responsibility without mercy can destroy people. Jesus refuses both simplifications, and this may explain why his teaching remains uncomfortable across every ideological boundary. Those who want unrestricted desire encounter his warning that intention can already violate another person. Those who want rigid control encounter his warning against judgment, hypocrisy, and public shame. Those who idolize marriage encounter his celibacy and his vision of a resurrection beyond marriage. Those who despise marriage encounter his defense of fidelity. Those who reduce women to temptation encounter his female disciples. Those who reduce love to emotion encounter his command to love enemies. No faction receives everything it wants. But one question remains. What did Jesus mean by love? Modern culture often divides love and desire into competing forces. Love is imagined as pure, generous, and spiritual. Desire is imagined as bodily, selfish, and dangerous. The gospel tradition does not offer such a simple division. Jesus speaks of love as action, loyalty, mercy, service, and the refusal to seek revenge. Love of neighbor is not merely affection. Love of enemy cannot depend upon attraction. Love of God is described as involving the whole heart, mind, soul, and strength. This love is not weak emotion. It reorganizes behavior. It can require the surrender of privilege. It can demand truth. It can resist possession. It can refuse to retaliate even while naming injustice. Desire, meanwhile, is not automatically opposed to love. Human beings desire food, companionship, justice, safety, beauty, family, recognition, and God. The problem begins when desire ceases to recognize the freedom of its object. Loving desire says, "I see you as a person whose good matters." Possessive desire says, "Your purpose is to satisfy me." The external action may not yet have occurred, but the moral worlds are already different. This difference offers a possible key to Matthew's teaching. Jesus is not demanding blindness to beauty. He is demanding sight purified of ownership. He is not ordering people to become less human. He is asking whether their humanity has room for the humanity of the person they desire. That interpretation also helps explain his approach to fidelity. Adultery is not wrong merely because a boundary has been violated on paper. It is wrong because promises, trust, households, and human beings are damaged. Divorce is not serious merely because a rule has been broken. It is serious because people can be discarded. Public shaming is not righteous merely because the accusation is correct. It can become another form of violence. Celibacy is not holy merely because sexual activity is absent. A celibate person can still be controlling, proud, exploitative, or consumed by fantasy. Marriage is not holy merely because a ceremony occurred. A married person can still use, intimidate, betray, or erase a spouse. For Jesus, the visible category is never enough. Married does not automatically mean faithful. Unmarried does not automatically mean pure. Religious does not automatically mean merciful. Condemned does not automatically mean beyond restoration. The heart reveals the direction beneath the label, but any teaching centered on the heart creates a psychological danger. How can a person know when an unwanted thought has become a chosen intention? What happens to individuals who experience intrusive thoughts they do not want? Can someone become trapped in endless self-monitoring, interpreting every sensation as moral failure? These questions are modern in language, but the problem is ancient. A morality of internal perfection can create scrupulosity, the fear that one has sinned through thoughts, emotions, or mental images that appeared without consent. People can begin examining every glance, dream, bodily reaction, or moment of attraction. The attempt to achieve purity becomes obsessive. Instead of creating freedom from domination, the teaching becomes domination by fear. Nothing in the gospel narratives suggests that Jesus wanted people imprisoned by involuntary mental events. His moral warnings focus on intention, cultivation, hypocrisy, hardness of heart, and actions flowing from within. A thought that arrives is not necessarily a thought embraced. A feeling is not identical to a plan. Temptation is not identical to consent. The gospel tradition itself portrays Jesus as tempted. Christian theology has traditionally distinguished temptation from sin for precisely this reason. The decisive question is not whether an impulse appeared. It is whether the person welcomed it, fed it, organized behavior around it, or chose to treat another person as an instrument. This distinction can be difficult, but without it the teaching becomes psychologically impossible. Human beings do not control every mental event. They do possess some ability to shape attention, habit, imagination, and action. The moral task is therefore not absolute mental emptiness. It is responsible relationship with desire. Recognize it. Name it honestly. Refuse to let it become entitlement. Do not build secret permission for betrayal. Do not blame the person who awakened the feeling. Do not confuse intensity with truth. Do not assume that wanting something creates a right to have it. This is where Jesus' teaching becomes intensely modern. Advertising is built upon desire. Digital platforms measure attention. Images are selected, edited, and distributed to hold the eye. People learn to present themselves as products while simultaneously consuming the presentation of others. Intimacy can be separated from responsibility. The human face becomes content. The human body becomes data. The human longing for connection becomes a market. Jesus lived in a world without screens, algorithms, or mass media. But the moral mechanism he identified remains recognizable. Looking can become taking. Attention can become possession. A person can be consumed without ever being touched. The ancient warning about the eye reaches into a culture organized around images. Yet the teaching must not be turned into fear of other people's bodies. The body is not an accusation. Beauty is not a crime. Attraction is not violence. The moral question begins when attention refuses the boundaries of the person observed. This applies beyond sexual desire. The rich can look at the poor as labor. The powerful can look at citizens as numbers. Religious institutions can look at believers as sources of obedience. Media can look at suffering as entertainment. Audiences can look at public figures as property. The logic is the same. A person becomes an object inside someone else's appetite. Jesus' teaching about the gaze may be one expression of a far larger moral revolution, the refusal to reduce human beings to what they can provide. But did Jesus reject pleasure? The gospel portrait does not fit the image of a teacher who avoided all celebration. He attends meals. His enemies accuse him of eating and drinking too freely. His parables include banquets, wedding celebrations, lamps, music, vineyards, feasts, bread, wine, lost coins, family reunions, and neighbors rejoicing together. The kingdom of God is repeatedly imagined not as an empty room but as a feast. The Gospel of John places Jesus' first sign at a wedding where wine has run out. Whatever historical judgment one makes about the miracle, the theological setting is revealing. The story does not begin in a desert of bodily hatred. It begins at a celebration of union, food, community, and abundance. Jesus' conflict is not with pleasure itself. It is with pleasure detached from love, justice, gratitude, and responsibility. Food can nourish or become greed. Wine can celebrate or destroy judgment. Authority can serve or dominate. Sexuality can express fidelity and tenderness or become deception and possession. The moral value is not located simply in the existence of appetite. It is found in the relationship between appetite and the good of others. Later Christian history sometimes lost this balance. Some theologians spoke as though sexual desire remained permanently suspicious even within marriage. Others defended marriage but treated its primary value as reproduction. Some religious cultures praised female virginity while treating women's bodies as sources of danger. Some demanded celibacy from leaders without creating healthy structures for emotional honesty and accountability. Some communities preached purity publicly while concealing exploitation privately. These failures cannot simply be placed upon one sentence of Jesus. They emerged through centuries of institutional development, cultural assumptions, political interests, theological debate, and human fear, but neither can interpretation be separated from consequences. When a teaching produces shame, the interpreter must ask whether shame is the intended fruit. When a rule protects reputation rather than victims, the community must ask whose morality it is serving. When purity language silences people who report abuse, purity has become a mask for corruption. When forgiveness is demanded from victims but repentance is not demanded from offenders, mercy has been reversed. The teachings of Jesus contain resources for exposing that reversal. He directs moral scrutiny toward the powerful. He places responsibility upon the person who looks and intends. He condemns leaders who burden others. He warns against secrecy used to hide corruption. He requires reconciliation, truthfulness, and concern for those with less status. But the same teachings can be misused when separated from those patterns. This is the shadow that follows every sacred text. Words do not remain alone. They enter institutions. Institutions create rules. Rules shape childhoods, marriages, identities, fears, and expectations. A sentence intended to challenge possessive men can be used to police women. A defense of marriage can be used to protect abusive households. A call to celibacy can become a demand for emotional denial. A warning against judgment can be used to avoid accountability. A message of forgiveness can be used to pressure the wounded into silence. The text does not automatically control its own future. Readers do, and readers bring power with them. This is why historical investigation matters. Context does not eliminate moral meaning. It prevents moral language from becoming a weapon detached from its original target. When Jesus confronts adultery in the heart, the issue is not an isolated bodily reflex. It is the hidden decision to take another person into one's imagination as an object of possession. When he restricts divorce, the issue is not preserving an institution at any cost. It is resisting the power to discard a person when commitment becomes inconvenient. When he speaks of eunuchs for the kingdom, the issue is not hatred of marriage. It is freedom from the belief that marriage and reproduction are the only paths to a meaningful life. When he gathers women into the movement, the issue is not creating a modern political program. It is recognizing discipleship where society may not expect it. When he warns against public condemnation, the issue is not pretending wrongdoing has no consequences. It is refusing to make another person's failure into a spectacle that protects the accuser from self-examination. These teachings form a moral architecture. At its center is not sexual fear. It is undivided love. Love that does not possess. Fidelity that does not perform. Mercy that does not deny responsibility. Discipline that does not become hatred of the body. Community that does not depend entirely upon marriage, bloodline, wealth, or status. This architecture is difficult because it cannot be maintained by appearance. A society can regulate behavior and remain cruel. A marriage can remain legally intact while love has been replaced by fear. A celibate life can appear disciplined while hiding domination. A permissive culture can celebrate freedom while ignoring exploitation. A religious culture can celebrate purity while ignoring hypocrisy. Jesus' teaching challenges both. It asks not only, "What are you permitted to do?" It asks, "What kind of person are you becoming through what you repeatedly choose to see, imagine, desire, and justify?" That question cannot be answered by a public label. It follows the individual into the silent room. But the investigation must end with humility. We do not possess a recording of Jesus explaining every possible application of his words. The Gospels preserve early memories interpreted through different communities. The Greek terms can carry ranges of meaning. The historical context can clarify a saying without resolving every modern debate. Christian denominations continue to disagree about marriage, celibacy, divorce, gender, sexual ethics, and the authority of tradition. Historians can identify textual development. They cannot scientifically prove theological revelation. Believers can find authority. They still must decide how that authority should be interpreted. No discovery removes human responsibility. Perhaps that is why these sayings remain alive. They refuse to become safe. They have inspired devotion and fear, liberation and control, fidelity and shame. They have been whispered in monasteries, preached at weddings, taught to children, debated by scholars, invoked in courtrooms, and carried silently by people struggling to understand their own minds. But beneath the centuries of argument stands a deceptively simple confrontation. What happens when desire meets another person's dignity? Does love recognize that person as free? Or does desire quietly rewrite the person as something owned? The hidden side of Jesus' moral teaching may not be hidden because it was suppressed by a secret institution. It may be hidden because human beings prefer visible rules. Visible rules allow comparison. They allow punishment. They allow us to identify the sinner across the room. The teaching of the heart removes that protection. It tells the respectable man that no applause can purify exploitation. It tells the religious leader that controlling others is not the same as controlling oneself. It tells the person consumed by shame that temptation is not identical to consent. It tells the married that a legal bond cannot replace love. It tells the unmarried that human worth does not depend upon finding a spouse. It tells the accuser to examine the hand holding the stone. And it tells everyone that the deepest moral struggle may begin in a place no audience will ever see. Perhaps Jesus was not asking humanity to destroy desire. Perhaps he was asking humanity to transform it, to move from hunger that consumes toward love that recognizes, from possession toward relationship, from secrecy toward integrity, from shame toward responsibility, from control toward freedom. And if that is true, then the final question is not whether human beings desire. They always have. The question is whether our desires teach us to see others more clearly, or whether they slowly make other people disappear. What do you believe Jesus was truly confronting? human attraction itself, or the hidden desire to possess another person? Share your interpretation in the comments, and subscribe to The Last Spliff, where we continue investigating the mysteries of history, religion, culture, and the great unanswered questions that have shaped the human story.